The town had always been quiet, the kind of place where the sound of church bells on a Sunday morning or the laughter of children in the park carried further than it should. It wasn't remarkable, not the sort of town you'd find on postcards or in magazines, but it was safe, steady, predictable. People liked it that way. They knew their neighbors, they waved at one another from porches, and they trusted the rhythm of their routines. But beneath all of that comfort, there were fractures, thin, almost invisible lines that nobody noticed until it was too late. The well sat at the far end of town, beyond a line of trees where the pavement thinned into gravel and the gravel gave way to dirt. It had been there long before most of the town was built, long before the grocery store with its bright neon sign or the tidy rows of houses with white fences. Some said the well had been dug in the 1800s, used by farmers when the town was just farmland and woods. Others joked it was older than that, something left behind by people who had lived on this land long before it was claimed. By the time the current generation came around, it was nothing more than an eyesore, boarded up, marked with a crooked sign that said danger. Keep away. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the rotting boards. Adults didn't give a second thought. Life around it went on, as usual. Mornings began with the smell of coffee drifting from kitchen windows, and by evening, headlights glowed along Main Street as people returned home. The town had its ordinary gossip, the mayor's stubbornness, the preacher's daughter sneaking around with boys she shouldn't, the wealthy family on the hill whose money bought them everything but respect. There were rules here, invisible but powerful, about who belonged and who didn't, about who could get away with things and who would pay for them. Everyone understood those rules, even if nobody said them out loud. Among the people who lived here, a few names carried more weight than others. One man was known for the size of his house and the sway of his money. He had a smile that convinced people to trust him, but behind closed doors, his voice could cut sharper than any knife. His wife walked through town with perfect hair and polite smiles, but her eyes always seemed tired, like she hadn't had a full night's sleep in years. Then there was the boy who worked at the gas station, always on the edge of trouble, the kind who looked like he was waiting for someone to finally give up on him. And the girl, too quiet for her own good, who lived in a house where shouting seemed louder than laughter. None of them knew how their lives were about to collide. There had been whispers for weeks, little things people brushed off at first. A strange smell drifts from the woods near the well. Dogs barking into the night, refusing to quiet down, no matter how many times their owner shouted. A woman swore she heard something moving under the ground when she walked by, though her husband laughed at her for saying it. These things should have been warnings, but in a place where routine ruled, people learned to silence their unease. They went on with their days, convincing themselves that the strange belonged to imagination. The summer it all began was unbearably hot, the kind of heat that made tempers shorter and nights longer. Tensions rose in small ways. A fight at the bar, a teacher snapping at her students, a father gripping his son's arm too tightly in public. Beneath the surface, something was breaking, though nobody wanted to admit it. Power sat in the hands of a few, and everyone else pretended they didn't notice. That silence, that willingness to ignore, would cost them more than they could ever imagine. For the families at the center of it, their lives before the discovery looked, at first glance, painfully ordinary. There were morning breakfasts filled with quiet chewing and clinking forks. There were nights when parents sat in front of the TV, children shut in their rooms with their secrets. But underneath, there was a heaviness no one could name. Control wrapped itself around some homes like a rope. Fear seeped into others. And in places where there should have been safety, there was instead a kind of slow, unseen rot. The well was just part of the landscape, forgotten, ignored, and rotting. But it had been waiting. What held had been hidden long enough that the town believed it didn't matter anymore. But when the boards finally gave way, when the truth clawed its way back into the light, the quiet safety of this town collapsed in on itself. People would whisper about what was found there for years, their voices low, as if saying it too loudly might bring the horror back. And for those whose lives were tied to that discovery, nothing would ever be the same. The heat didn't let up that summer. Every day felt heavier than the last, and people's patience wore thin under the sun. Little things that were once brushed aside started to matter. Words carried sharper edges. Old grudges began to surface, and the quiet town found itself holding its breath without knowing why. The well still stood boarded and forgotten at the edge of the woods, but the atmosphere in town had shifted. Something was pushing people closer to a breaking point. The gas station. The boy who worked long shifts began to notice the way customers looked at him. He'd always been the kind who seemed out of place, but lately the suspicion in their eyes felt different, like they were waiting for him to mess up. He carried the weight of bills he couldn't pay and a mother who reminded him daily that he wasn't enough. Every time he handed back change, he could feel judgment in the silence between coins hitting palms. That silence built inside him, feeding his resentment, making him believe that maybe everyone in this town wanted him to fail. The wealthy man on the hill tightened his grip on everything he could control. His business had started showing cracks, debts hidden behind polished smiles and charity donations. In public, he was the picture of success, shaking hands, promising help, buying influence. But at home, his temper sharpened. He couldn't stand the thought of losing face, of people whispering that he wasn't as powerful as he claimed. His wife had learned long ago to read the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed when anger was close. She wore her silence like armor, keeping secrets even from herself. But the bruises of words and actions that never reached the outside world festered inside her. The girl down the street felt it too, the pressure, the watching eyes. She moved quietly, always careful, always trying not to take up too much space. Her family's shouting never stopped, even when neighbors closed their windows to block it out. At school, she was invisible. At home, she was trapped. She carried secrets in her notebooks, scribbled words she'd never speak aloud. And in those pages, she imagined escape, but every door seemed locked. That it was around this time that the whispers about the well grew louder. Teenagers joked about it, daring each other to go near after dark. Some swore they saw lights moving in the woods. A man walking home late one night claimed he heard someone crying near the boards. He didn't check, just hurried past, telling himself it must have been an animal. People laughed when he mentioned it, but their laughter didn't reach their eyes. Small incidents fanned the growing unease. At the bar, the gas station boy got into a fight with a man who mocked his father for leaving. It ended with broken glass and blood on the floor, and though the boy swore he hadn't started it, everyone seemed eager to believe he had. The wealthy man's wife was spotted at the pharmacy, buying something she hid quickly in her purse. A prescription, whispered the clerk later, one for nerves. The girl's teacher noticed bruises on her arms, but when asked, she gave the same quiet answer she always did. I'm fine. Behind closed doors, the wealthy man's rage grew. He accused his wife of slipping, of making him look weak. He controlled where she went, who she spoke to, and what money she touched. She started avoiding mirrors, unable to face the reflection of the woman she'd become, powerless in a life built on appearances. But she wasn't as powerless as he believed. She was watching, waiting, and deep down, something inside her had begun to harden. The gas station boy, meanwhile, found himself drawn into the orbit of the girl from the shouting house. They started talking in quiet places, the edge of the parking lot, behind the church where no one could see. She didn't laugh much, but when she did, it was small and fragile, like she didn't believe she was allowed. He felt something shift in him when she looked at him, a need to protect her, to prove he wasn't the failure everyone thought. She, in turn, saw in him a way out, or at least someone who understood what it felt like to be unwanted. Their bond was fragile, born of desperation more than trust, but it grew quickly in the cracks of their lives. Secrets began to layer over secrets. The wealthy man started borrowing money from people he shouldn't have, men whose smiles never reached their eyes. The boy took cash from the register at work, telling himself it was just once, just to get by. The girl stopped going home some nights, lying that she was with friends. Each decision, small on its own, pulled them closer to the well, closer to the thing none of them yet knew waited. The town itself seemed to sense something was coming. Church pews were fuller, not because faith had grown stronger, but because fear needed a place to hide. Parents warned children not to wander. Dogs barked more. Doors stayed locked. And still, the air carried that strange, heavy smell near the woods. What none of them realized was how entangled they already were. The wealthy man's wife had begun leaving notes for herself, small scraps of paper tucked away where only she could find them. Remember, you're not crazy. Remember the truth. The boy started keeping a knife in his pocket, just in case. The girl hid her notebooks where no one would think to look, writing down things she was too afraid to say. And at the center of it all was the well, silent, boarded up, waiting for the moment when all their paths would meet. Why then, even the smallest spark could have set everything on fire. A careless word, a wrong glance, a choice made in anger. The pressure was building, and none of them had the strength to stop it. The night it happened, the air was heavy and close, thick with the kind of stillness that makes people uneasy. No breeze, no rustle of leaves, just the weight of silence pressing down on everything. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving the woods in darkness except for the faint glow of headlights cutting through the trees. The well, half rotting and forgotten, stood waiting at the edge of the clearing, its boards sagging like ribs around a secret Tea hadn't started as a plan, at least not for everyone. The boy thought he was just meeting the girl. She had slipped out of her house again, bruises hidden under her sweater, whispering that she couldn't stand another night in that place. He had promised her they'd figure something out, maybe run, maybe disappear to somewhere no one would care who they were. But when they reached the clearing, they weren't alone. The wealthy man's wife had been there first, pacing with trembling hands, clutching at the scraps of courage she'd been gathering for weeks. She had asked him to meet her there, though he didn't know why until the headlights came into view. The wealthy man stepped out of his car, his shadow stretching across the ground. He wasn't supposed to be there, not in the way the others were, but he had been following, suspicious, unable to let go of the control he demanded. His presence sent a jolt of fear through the clearing. His voice broke the silence, sharp and accusing, words laced with venom that turned the air colder than the night itself. He had been waiting for proof, for a reason to unleash the anger he carried like a weapon. Now, here it was, all gathered at the foot of the old well. The shouting began almost at once. He accused his wife of betrayal, his words spitting with rage, cutting her down to nothing. She tried to hold her ground, but years of submission weighed her shoulders, made her voice falter. The boy stepped forward, not out of bravery, but instinct, trying to shield the girl behind him. That only drew the man's fury toward him. He called him worthless, a thief, trash that didn't deserve the air he breathed. The boy clenched his fists, heat rising in his chest, the knife in his pocket suddenly heavy. The girl's breath came fast, her hand shaking as she gripped his sleeve, whispering for him not to. The argument swelled like a storm, words crashing over one another, drowning out reason. The wealthy man advanced, his anger physical, a presence that seemed to tower over them all. The boy's heart pounded in his ears. He thought of every look of judgment, every time he'd been told he'd never be more than a failure. He saw the man's hand lift, maybe to strike, maybe to push, but in that instant, instinct and fear collided. The knife flashed out, a quick, desperate motion that cut through the dark. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the man staggered back, his eyes wide in shock, his hand pressed against the spreading red on his shirt. The sound he made wasn't a scream, not really, but a low, guttural moan that chilled everyone there. He fell hard, his body hitting the ground with a thud that seemed too loud, too final. The boy stood frozen, the knife trembling in his grip, his breath ragged, as if the world had been ripped out from under him. The girl gasped, covering her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. The wife let out a broken cry, somewhere between relief and horror, her knees buckling beneath her. Panic erupted in the clearing. The boy dropped the knife, his hand shaking, staring at the blood that coated his fingers. He hadn't meant to do it. Not like this, not here. He told himself it had been self-defense, that he hadn't had a choice, but the words didn't quiet the pounding in his head. The girl clung to him, whispering frantically that they had to leave, that they couldn't stay. The wife crawled to her husband's side, pressing her hands against his wound, whispering apologies through sobs. But the man's breaths were shallow, uneven, and fading fast. The smell of iron filled the clearing, thick and suffocating. The boards of the well loomed in the background, like a mouth waiting to swallow the truth. The boy backed away, his mind spinning, torn between running and staying, between protecting the girl and saving himself. The wife's eyes met his in the darkness, wide and hollow, as if silently begging him to fix what couldn't be undone. That it was she who said it first. No one can know. Her voice cracked but carried weight. She spoke of what would happen if the town found out, of reputations destroyed, of lives shattered beyond repair. She had lived long enough under her husband's shadow to know the power of appearances. And now that he was bleed, out at the edge of the woods, her fear twisted into something sharper, survival. The boy shook his head, refusing, but the girl's trembling voice joined in. She was terrified of what her family would do if they found out she had been there, if they knew what she had seen. The thought of going home was worse than the thought of silence. She begged him, pleaded through tears, until his resistance cracked under the weight of her desperation. The wealthy man gasped one last time, his chest shuddering, then stilled. The night seemed to grow even quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The wife sat back, her hands covered in blood, staring at what she had both dreaded and wanted in equal measure. She whispered again. No one can know. The well stood a few feet away, its boards weak, the ground around it damp and sinking. They moved as if in a trance, dragging the heavy body through the dirt, each second stretching into an eternity. The boy's arms burned with effort, his stomach turning with nausea, his mind screaming at him to stop. But he didn't. The wife guided them, her voice steady now, her fear transmuted into cold determination. The girl couldn't watch, turning her face away, sobbing into her hands. When the boards finally gave way, the sound echoed into the hollow space below. The darkness swallowed the body with a sickening thud, the well closing around the secret it had been waiting for all along. The boy stood at the edge, staring into the abyss, his chest heaving, his heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. His hands shook violently, the blood on his skin refusing to fade even when he rubbed it against his jeans. The wife straightened, her face pale but set, as if a switch inside her had flipped. The girl wrapped her arms around herself, her small frame trembling, whispering over and over, "We shouldn't have done this." The night seemed endless after that. They scattered, each of them carrying the weight of what they'd done. The boy walked in circles for hours before daring to go home, his thoughts looping between guilt and fear. The girl didn't sleep, lying awake with swollen eyes, listening to the silence in her house and imagining the sound of the man's last breath. The wife scrubbed her hands raw, but the blood clung to her in ways soap couldn't reach. The well had taken its secret, but the town would not stay quiet for long. The crime had been done, and with it, the fragile balance of their lives was shattered. What remained was chaos, fear, and a desperate hope that no one would ever look too closely at the rotting boards in the woods. Morning light didn't feel the same after that night. It wasn't warm or gentle. It was sharp, cutting through curtains and forcing everyone to face what they had done. The woods looked the same. The streets were quiet in the same way they always were. But for those who had stood at the well, nothing was ordinary anymore. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed longer, and every face in town carried the risk of suspicion. The boy woke with the knife's weight still heavy in his hand, though it lay tuck. Ed deep in his drawer now, scrubbed clean until his knuckles bled. He told himself he hadn't meant to kill. He told himself it had been an accident, self-defense, that anyone in his place would have done the same. But the more he repeated those words, the emptier they felt. He could still hear the man's breath as it rattled out, see his eyes widening in shock, feel the warm blood on his skin. Guilt clung to him like sweat, thick and suffocating. He went to work, forced smiles at customers, handed out change with steady hands, but inside he was unraveling. The girl carried the crime differently. For her, it was silence. She didn't write in her notebook anymore. The words refused to come. Instead, she sat in her room with her arms wrapped around her knees, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She thought about the body falling into the well, about the hollow sound it made when it hit the bottom, and she hated herself for looking away. She didn't know if she hated the boy too, for what he'd done, for what she'd begged him to help hide, or if she needed him now more than ever. At school, she avoided everyone's eyes. When her teacher asked a question, she answered with a voice so small it barely counted as sound. The bruise on her arm had faded, but the new one on her heart only grew darker. The wife moved like a ghost through her own house. The rooms were quiet without her husband's voice filling them. But the silence was not freedom. It was emptiness. She stood in front of mirrors, trying to see what kind of woman she had become, the kind who let her husband bleed out on the dirt and then helped shove his body into a well. She told herself he had deserved it. She told herself she was free now. But freedom didn't taste sweet. It tasted like iron and fear. She scrubbed the floors until her hands blistered, not because they were dirty, but because she couldn't get the stains in her mind to fade. Outside their homes, the town began to stir with rumors. The wealthy man hadn't been seen in days. His business partners whispered behind closed doors, speculating about money troubles or secret trips. Neighbors noticed his car hadn't moved from the driveway, and some claimed they saw his wife pacing at night, staring out the window like she was waiting for someone who never came home. At church, prayers were said for his health, though a few muttered under their breath that maybe his sins had finally caught up with him. Days turned into weeks, and his absence grew heavier. The police were called, first with concern, then with suspicion. They searched his office, questioned his wife. She played her part well, tears falling on cue, her voice breaking as she said she didn't know where he'd gone. She told them he had been under stress, that maybe he'd left to clear his head. The officers nodded, but didn't look convinced. A man like him didn't just vanish. The boy avoided the woods altogether, terrified that someone would stumble on the broken boards, that the well would give up its secret. Every time he saw a patrol car pass the gas station, his stomach flipped, certain they were coming for him. He started drinking at night to drown out the guilt, to blur the memory of the knife in his hand. But no amount of whiskey made it go away. He dreamed of the man's eyes, of the sound of his wife's voice saying no one can know. The girl grew distant, even from him. She stopped meeting him behind the church, stopped answering when he called. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Fear of being tied to him, fear of the secret they shared, fear of what would happen when the truth eventually crawled out of the well. She wanted to believe she could pretend it hadn't happened, but every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that clearing, the smell of blood thick in her nose for the wife, Taish. The aftermath was complicated. People offered her sympathy, brought food to her door, and wrapped her in the kind of kindness she had never known while her husband was alive. But behind their words, she could see the questions in their eyes. Some pitted her, others suspected her, and in the quiet of her bedroom, she wondered which she preferred. She wore black, attended meetings, and answered questions with trembling hands. But beneath it all, she was calculating, waiting, bracing for the moment when everything might collapse. The police search grew larger. Dogs were brought to the woods. For days, people whispered about strange, since the dogs seemed to catch near the trees, about officers marking the ground near the well. But then the boards were deemed too unsafe, too unstable to move without equipment, and the search shifted elsewhere. Relief washed over the wife, though it was temporary. Secrets buried in the ground had a way of clawing back to the surface. The town's perception began to fracture. Some painted the missing man as a victim, a hard-working figure undone by tragedy. Others whispered that maybe his wealth had been built on shadows, that maybe someone had finally gotten tired of living under his thumb. The gossip twisted through grocery aisles and church pews, but no one spoke too loudly. No one wanted to be the first to say what they really thought, that something terrible had happened, and the truth was hiding among them, that in private, the boy's guilt consumed him. He thought about confessing, about ending the torment by putting the truth in someone else's hands. But then he thought of the girl, of how it would destroy her, of how she would never forgive him. He thought of the wife, her blood-stained hands reaching toward him in the dark, demanding silence. And so he said nothing. His silence was its own prison, locking him into a life of paranoia. The girl withdrew further, her notebooks untouched, her eyes hollow. Her family's shouting went on, but she barely heard it anymore. She had been carrying too much for too long, and now the weight of the secret pressed her into the ground. She wanted to scream, to let it out, but the fear of what would follow kept her quiet. She told herself she was protecting the boy, protecting herself, but in truth, she was only slowly breaking apart. The wife adjusted to her new role, the grieving widow. She wore her sadness like a mask, perfect and convincing. But at night, when the house was still, she pressed her hands together until her knuckles whitened, praying not for forgiveness, but for the strength to keep lying. She told herself the town would never know, that the well would hold its silence. But deep down, she knew nothing buried stayed hidden forever. The crime had been committed, the body hidden, but the ripples spread outward, through homes, through streets, through the village. Isprza would not stop. The boy carried guilt, the girl carried fear, the wife carried secrets, and the town carried suspicion. Their fragile world had already cracked. Now, it was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. For months, the town lived in a strange half-light, a place caught between knowing and pretending not to know. The wealthy man's disappearance became a headline, then a mystery, and finally a story told in lowered voices. Flyers with his face yellowed in the sun, fluttering on telephone poles until the tape gave out and they scattered like ghosts in the wind. The investigation stalled, stretched thin over too many theories, but the truth, the one buried in the well, stayed hidden just out of reach. But time, as it always does, began to unravel the silence. It wasn't one big revelation that cracked the secret open, but a collection of small things. A neighbor who remembered seeing the car near the woods that night. A coworker who noticed the boy's sudden drinking, his shaking hands. A classmate who overheard the girl crying in the bathroom, whispering about blood. Each piece alone was fragile, but together they painted a picture no one could ignore. The police returned to the woods. This time, they didn't stop at the warning boards. With chains and tools, they tore the rotten planks aside, and the smell hit them first, a thick, undeniable stench that rose from the depths. What they found inside was what had been feared all along. A body, decomposed but recognizable, the suit torn and stained, the wealthy man's face twisted in the stillness of death. The well had given up its secret. The fallout was immediate. The boy was questioned first, pulled from the gas station with the eyes of the town burning into him. He tried to hold his story together, tried to keep the knife out of his words, but his guilt had already eaten away at him. He broke under the weight of it, his voice cracking as he admitted what he had done. Not a confession meant to cleanse him, but a collapse, the words spilling out because he no longer had the strength to hold them in. The girl was pulled in next, her pale face trembling under the harsh lights. She told the truth in fragments, her voice halting, her hands twisting in her lap. She spoke of fear, of pressure, of a night that spun out of control. She was not blamed for the knife, but the burden of her silence still clung to her. The law could not charge her with murder, but it could not absolve her either. She became something else in the town's eyes. Not guilty, not innocent, just marked forever by what she had seen. The wife was the last. Her act of grief, so carefully crafted, shattered in the face of the evidence. Her tears no longer convinced anyone. Her involvement wasn't as direct, but her role in hiding the crime, in guiding the others to the well, was undeniable. She was charged not for the stabbing, but for what came after, for helping conceal a body, for obstructing justice. Yet in a strange way, some still pitied her, saw her as another victim of the man's control. Others despised her more than the boy, believing she had wanted this outcome all along. The trial that followed was the largest the town had ever seen. Courtrooms packed, reporters spilled onto the steps, and every detail was dissected for the public. The boy's face appeared on television screens, a mix of defiance and regret. The girl was shielded as much as possible, her name kept from headlines, but the whispers in town always found her. The wife sat, in silence through most of it, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands folded neatly as though she were attending a church service instead of her own undoing it. In the end, the sentences fell like stones. The boy received years behind bars, the weight of his crime matched by the mercy of recognizing his youth and his claim of self-defense. The wife was handed a shorter term, but left the courtroom with the understanding that freedom would never truly return. The girl walked free, legally untouched, but she carried scars that no sentence could measure. The community fractured. For some, the wealthy man became a martyr, a respected figure taken too soon. For others, the truth of his cruelty, whispers of abuse, of financial deceit, painted him as a man who had reaped what he sowed. Neighbors who once stood shoulder to shoulder now argued in grocery aisles, divided over who deserved sympathy and who deserved blame. The town's reputation shifted, too. What was once known as a quiet, safe place now bore a new name in headlines. The town of the Well, on a broader scale, the case stirred conversations far beyond its borders. People debated the balance between justice and mercy, between law and morality. Was the boy a murderer or a victim of circumstance? Was the wife complicit or simply desperate for escape? And what of the girl, whose silence had been forced by fear stronger than any court order? The crime became more than a single tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of morality when power, fear, and desperation collide. For the boy, prison became both punishment and escape. The routine gave him something the outside world never had, structure, but the guilt never left. In his letters, written to no one in particular, he spoke of the well, of the sound it made when it swallowed the man whole. He wondered if he would ever stop hearing it. He doubted he would. The girl grew older, but the night grew with her. She moved away, tried to rebuild somewhere no one knew her name, but the weight of what she carried never fully lifted. She avoided relationships, avoided closeness, was afraid of secrets, afraid of what silence could cost. Some nights, she still woke with the smell of blood in her nose. The wife left prison with streaks of gray in her hair and a body that carried years of stress. She returned to a house that no longer felt like hers, its walls too quiet, its windows too open. People crossed the street to avoid her. Others whispered their pity, but never invited her back into their lives. Freedom was a word she no longer recognized. The town itself never fully recovered. The well was filled in, the ground sealed, but the story could not be buried. Children who once dared each other to touch their boards, now dared each other to whisper the names of those involved. The woods carried a permanent shadow, as though the earth itself remembered what had been hidden there. In the end, justice was served in the only way it could be, through trials, through sentences, through names written into legal records. But justice is not the same as healing. Lives have been broken beyond repair, reputations shattered, innocence lost. The community had been forced to confront truths it had long ignored. The hidden violence in homes, the weight of power in the hands of the wealthy, the silence that keeps abuse alive. The crime at the well was more than a single act of violence. It was the culmination of fear, control, and desperation. It showed how fragile morality can be when people are pushed to their limits, how the choices made in a single night can ripple outward for years. And it left behind a question that no trial could answer. In a balance of guilt and survival, who among them was truly free? The town never found peace, only memory. And every time someone spoke of what they found in the well, their voice dropped to a whisper, as though the earth itself might be listening, waiting, ready to remind them of the night that closed the town forever.